Is Lily Gordon here? Lily?
Another Lily. Good morning, everybody. Oh, evening, sorry. Oh, okay.
Only a few more hours.
So, yeah, I'm really moved by the testimony that we've already heard, and I'm also really moved by the amount of sympathy that a lot of you have already expressed. I myself am not low income, but I am deeply in support of this bill for a couple of reasons. When I was a teenager, I grew up in New York City. I'm a Rhode Islander now, but I grew up in New York City, and when Hurricane Sandy hit the city, everybody lost power, and for days we had to walk around our apartments in the dark, maybe holding candles or a flashlight if we had them. And I remember that this most devastatingly affected my elderly neighbors. And this was a natural disaster. This was something that, affected the infrastructure itself. It was, not a human decision. And I remember all of the things that it touched in my life. And it, the lights, the water, the refrigerator, like all of the little things that are so necessary in order to live your life. And I literally cannot imagine having to deal with that on a regular basis, not because of a hurricane, of a natural disaster, but because that was just the price of being low income, and that was within the law for the utility company to decide to shut that down. It's inhumane. And I was so moved by what happened with that hurricane that I actually studied public health, and I studied climate change, and I studied power outages, and I wanted to understand, how do things like power outages, power loss affect human health? And it really does. There's so many studies, there's so many public health studies that show that power outages increase the rate of hospitalizations and mortality, especially amongst people who are already vulnerable because they're older or they have pre-existing health conditions. To give you some examples, we're talking about everything from, okay, we don't have heat, so maybe we can use our space heater, but those are linked to higher rates of house fires. Okay, we don't have electricity to turn on the lights, so let's use a candle, but those are linked to higher rates of house fires. Now you've got fire trucks having to put out these fires, maybe you've got families having to go to the hospital because of these fires, right? And it's also linked to higher rates of carbon monoxide poisoning because the detectors aren't able to work. It's related to higher rates of temperature-related diseases like hypothermia and pneumonia and lots of other things, gastrointestinal diseases, and a whole host of other diseases. And it really does affect most prominently those who are already vulnerable. I also want to draw attention to the fact that, what are the ways in which this shutoffs affect children who need to do homework at night, but maybe their parents can't afford to turn on the lights? This is affecting educational outcomes. I feel like I'm speaking to the choir, but we're really talking about issues that are fundamental to the question of human health. And as Camila had already said, I think that it's enough to just think about the effect on health, the effect on lives, the effect on education, without even having to think about, the cost of everything, of having to pay for putting out literal fires, having to foot the medical bills for all of these increased hospitalizations, having to pay for the caskets if someone freezes to death in their own home or gets a heat stroke. And so, I'm trying to think if there's anything else I want to say. I appreciate that what it seems like this committee is at the point of figuring out, okay, how do we implement this? Because I think that it's so important for all of us to be on the same page that, you know, from a public health standpoint, from a human rights standpoint, we're really at a point where we can't just tell low-income Rhode Islanders, sorry, you're just going to have to deal with it. You're just going to have to decide whether or not you're going to feed your kids or you're going to let them, you know, freeze in their beds. And to add on to the other Lily's point, so as I said before, I'm not low income, but I do live in a old house in Rhode Island, and I also get drafts coming in through the windows, and the floors in my bedroom have holes that leak into the basement, and so there's all this cold air that's been coming in all winter. And I know that there's a lot of housing like that that is much more prominent amongst people who are low income. And I was so cold that I remember there was a night in which I was wearing 5 sweaters and had 3 blankets covering me, and I could still not fall asleep because I was so cold because it was so below freezing. And because I am not low income, I did turn up the heat, and I had to turn it on so high so that I could fall asleep at night. And when we got the bill, my roommate and I had to like sit down and talk about it because it was really high and it was a lot for us. But, you know, but it was still something that we could pay. And to imagine a family that is low income getting that bill would have just been devastating, and that's not fair. I mean, if it's it's less than a cup of coffee to help a low income family be able to stay, I'm happy to do it. Test. You guys have any
I think
other
that
questions?
microphone's coming in and out. Are there any questions for Lily? Seeing none? Thank you so much for your testimony.
Thank you.
Hake